Hey everybody, how's it going? It's David Griscom here doing another live stream. Looks like there are already some folks in here, which is great. Let me know if my mics or audio or anything like that is off, but I think I should be all good to go. I got my internet all fixed up and ready. Sorry for the state of my apartment. I just moved into a new place, so I'm still sort of figuring things out, but don't let that slow us down. So yeah, today I'm going to talk a little bit about left populism and some of the ideas that I've been having about it, especially after the Bernie Sanders withdrawal from the race, sort of where we're standing today, and starting to ask these big questions that we're starting to to need to work through. After basically losing the glue that was holding a lot of the left-wing movement in the United States together. But also this is like a Q&A, so please, don't hesitate to ask questions or jump in with super chats. We've really been dealing a lot with YouTube, not only just with them demonetizing our videos, but with like kind of nonsense copyright claims and stuff against us. So, being able to help us out with those super chats is very, very important for us to keep everything going and continuing to grow. Also, be sure to check out Michael's new book, Against the Web. You can get it read Emma's. We read a pretty good review last week by a very serious reader. And and tomorrow we have a show, normal time, 7 o'clock. But yeah, so I want to start with, talking about left populism. And that's something that is a difficult conversation to have because left populism means a lot of different things for different folks, right? A lot of people, there's a kind of folk understanding of what populism is, right? Which is sort of this idea of the people versus the elite, which is somewhat historically grounded, but it's very much overstated. The kind of like empty politics, the politics that substitute a kind of like a concept of the people that's kind of fuzzy with like class politics. If you look at the People's Party and the movements in the United States at the end of the 19th century, these people were actually like, it's class politics. I mean, it was a pretty early kind of socialist understanding. It was at least class politics, and that represented certain classes in the American South and the Midwest against the kind of speculative capital, against the merchant capital, against people who are able to make their money off of the banking system. So, that's the kind of historical grounding of populism, right? It was a very kind of proto-socialist politics. In fact, Eugene Debs was a member of the populist movement and then went on to be a part of the Socialist Party of the U.S., right? So there's a socialist tradition, and I would actually put the populist movement very distinctly in the American socialist tradition. But then there is what's called left populism, right? Which was a new strategy that was developed sort of towards the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the major shifts that had happened in socialist politics, right? Where people were starting to say like, okay, the Soviet Union has collapsed. In Western Europe, the socialist parties have never really taken power and implemented the agenda. Like, what's next for the left? And, it was a time of where people were asking a lot of questions, much like today. What is left politics? What is socialist politics? How can we seize state power? How can we enact the changes that we need to see in society, right? And there's a very famous book by Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, right, called Hegemony and Social Strategy Towards a Radical Democratic Politics. And this was a very controversial book. It's still very controversial. And I just sort of want to walk through it because at the end, I'm going to criticize it. And I'm going to say that a lot of the problems that we're seeing today, the kind of murkiness of a lot of left politics, actually come out of this destabilization of the class politics that came through this idea of left populism. So the cheap and dirty version of what left populism was supposed to represent was to say that we need to move away from class politics instead and rather focus towards creating a kind of popular class. Not that you don't support the workers, right? But that you recognize that there's a lot of other people who are basically outside the cultural hegemony of the time. And the idea is that you can get all of these different groups that are basically on the outside of society to create what is called like a chain of equivalence, right? You have all of these different groups and you say to them, all right, we're going to stand together. We recognize that we're not the same, and we're going to create this popular movement that is able to create a cultural hegemony that will be able to win popular power. Thanks so much for, by the way, a glass half empty. We really appreciate these super chats, as I was saying earlier. Yeah, so, you know, this idea is that you create this kind of like this chain of different groups that are able to come together and create, you know, a popular movement, that you create basically the concept of the people. Because what is the people, right? The people as compared to what, right? And like in the kind of populist rhetoric that Mouffe and Laclau were talking about, it was definitely like the people versus the elites. And you can see how there's like a right version of populism, which in a lot of ways was like the Donald Trump movement, right? Which is like, oh, these like elites have had power for too long, and we're going to return, as Donald Trump said, power to the American people, which obviously is BS. But, you know, there's a kind of like that kind of rhetoric, right? People versus the elites isn't the terrain of the left wing exclusively. But basically, Laclau and Mouffe they called it post-Marxism, right? So they were coming out of Marxism. They were like, especially Laclau, Ernesto Laclau, were coming out of Marxism. And the idea was that, you know, the kind of vanguardist party, the Leninist party, and then the kind of democratic socialist movements were unable to maintain the kind of popular support. A big argument basically against like the Leninist vision or the vanguard party, the real communist party, was that like when you put a signifier, the proletariat, and like say this is what communists do, this is what communists think, and you start to determine it, it becomes very violent in the sense that if anything stands outside of it, it has to be beaten down. So that's sort of like, and again, this is like a dirty, you know, this is a pretty well established like group of theorists and thought, and I'm not going to be able to do, you know, as much as I'd like to be able to deep dive and dig into everything, but these are just so we can be playing with the same terms a little bit. So they're rejecting the kind of like traditional communist strategy for politics. Because of Stalin, right? Stalin represents something that is like the deviation from what they wanted it, and everyone says, okay, well now we have to come back and like imagine all politics. So now we're in like, you know, in the 80s, you know, you're dealing with like the rise of neoliberalism, and this was the way that they thought that you could create power was by what is called the empty signifier politics, right? Which is that you put an idea in people's head that is able to encompass a lot of different things for different people. So I know that sounds fuzzy, so let me try to make it concrete. Think about like President Bush, Bush W, right? After 9/11, terrorism became an empty signifier in the sense that like all of these classes in the United States, from like the wealthy elites to working class people, workers, military families, people in New York City, people across the South, right? There was this fear of terrorism, right? And it never needed to be like, you know, concretely defined. It meant something to everybody. And by using that as an anchor point, like as a nodal point for politics, you were able to create a mass movement that ended up, you know, creating this neoconservative movement that was able to maintain itself in power, despite the fact that what Bush essentially was doing was enriching the ruling class, not necessarily doing anything for everyone else, but there's this kind of empty signifier politics. So it was able to hold together this group. So you can see where like this politics has a lot of legs, because what it essentially is able to do is it's able to create a mass, right, a people where there was sort of, you know, chaos and differing groups and differing opinions. And, you know, on a certain level, I think it's definitely true in a neutral sense that this is a way to maintain or at least create power. But the question is, one, maintaining it, and two, and thanks so much to Joshua for the super chat. You know, like, and the difficulty is maintaining power once you have it, right? Because neoconservatism has sort of collapsed, and now we have this kind of Donald Trump was able to like really capture this ready-made politics that was created from a kind of like right politics. And that's the thing too about the empty signifier politics, is it's hard to even call it populism, right? Because if Bush was doing it, is that really populism? But anyways, not to go down a tangent, Laclau, when Bush was coming into power, was saying that the next stage of politics across the West was going to be these populist politics. And I think that Laclau was absolutely vindicated. I think that, what you've seen from right-wing populism in Europe to whatever this variant of what Trumpism sort of represents, to these kind of left populist movements. And again, when we're talking about, theory, it's separate from practice. So left populism in Europe, I think that the best example of it is going to be, Podemos in Spain. And Iglesias, who is the leader of Podemos, studied with Chantal Mouffe, is very much ingrained, very much was coming out of this left populist idea and trying to enact it into politics. Now, there are other left populist movements in France. And then you have what was going on in the US and the UK, where I think this is the articulation that matters for us the most to start to theorize about, because, Podemos is operating in a very different context. They weren't able to maintain or capture state power, and they had a very impressive rise. But the question is where that goes next, and I think that's a different thing to explore. But what happened in the United States and the UK is you have Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, right? And thanks so much, Obro13. Shout out to ILWU Local 13 for sure. And Phil Smart sitting us up with a super chat too. Appreciate it. Yeah, definitely smash that the like button. Okay, so now we have the kind of basis of what left populism was in a theory sense from Laclau and Mouffe, and then we started to see what it meant in practice in the United States and the UK. Now, I don't think that Bernie Sanders, you could call him a left populist in the sense of the tradition of Mouffe and Laclau. I think that Bernie Sanders represented a very different tendency. I think that Bernie Sanders represented a kind of an American populist spirit, in the sense that he was very much inspired by Debs and by these kind of American popular movements that really did rise up, and create a new form of politics. But I think there were some deficiencies that we've seen with the Bernie Sanders movement that come out of that form of populism and out of left populism more in general, because a lot of the people who became influential came out of this, left populist movement, or at least studied it. I mean, it's a very influential. If you spend any time reading democratic or socialist theory, you're going to engage eventually with Laclau and Mouffe. I mean, these are very important works. But I think that we need to move past them, because the fundamental mistake is the simple criticism of left populism, right? Is that you decenter class, right? You decenter class for a kind of vaguer notion. And the problem with creating this kind of vague notion of what our politics represents, instead of doing a kind of strong working class rooted politics, is one, maintaining power once you're in power, which we unfortunately didn't get to have that experience with Bernie Sanders, right? Because it's more difficult to maintain power if you don't have the kind of class position that is fundamental to socialist politics, right? If you're not saying that we want to get power because we want to use that to empower the working class on the shop floor in their daily lives, and use the state basically as a tool in the class fight against the bourgeoisie, right? You can't articulate that kind of demand without having a class-based understanding. So what you're left with is kind of maintenance politics, right? Where it's you're doing a lot of important things for people who are marginalized and attacked by the capitalist system, but you're never going to be able to break out of it or to start to enter into new modes of production and relationships with one another, because you don't have that fundamental view. And, I think one of the things that is so true about history is that being aware of the class that you're a member of is probably one of the most important weapons that you can have in politics. The bourgeois and the bourgeois revolutions, they understood the role and the importance of the bourgeoisie against the monarchy, right? They understood that they had the money, that they had a lot of power and influence. And because they had that kind of proto-class consciousness, they were able to use that to basically, break out of the last vestiges of feudalism and monarchy, right? To destroy the old perks of the aristocracy in the pursuit of a kind of like liberal, bourgeois liberal republic system, right? They had the kind of consciousness that was necessary, not in the Marxist sense, but they understood, we are like the free individuals, right? The kind of like liberal philosophy that became articulated that led to these massive bourgeois revolutions came out of a class consciousness that the bourgeoisie have. If the working class doesn't have that kind of consciousness, we'll never be able to break out of this system. So it's very important that our politics doesn't reject that fact, right? That fundamental fact about politics and about philosophy, right? You're not going to be able to create a viable movement if we're constantly having to come up with new ways to connect with one another. The populist movement, for example, was in the United States in the late 19th century, was able to mobilize so many people so quickly. Not because they made complicated arguments about the chain of equivalence or even kumbaya stuff. It was literally just like, hey, are you being screwed over by the merchants in town? Are you being screwed over by the bankers? Right? Because there was this massive speculation that was going on after the Civil War, right? And it was hurting workers, and it was hurting predominantly small scale farmers and a lot of people in the rural parts of the country, black and white. And they were able to appeal to people on the basic levels, like, can you take care of your family at the end of the harvest, right? No. And the reason is because the people with the money are using their relationships with DC to create a kind of monetary system that was very much predatory towards a working class and farmers, right? So again, right, this is like our history of where this was a successful movement, right? Was actually being very rooted in the class politics and in the relationship between the bourgeois. The tension between the bourgeoisie and the working class, right? And we can't move away from that, because that has been the one thing that's been the most successful with our movement throughout our history. So I think one of the problems that we have fallen into is now we had Bernie Sanders, who was able to create that kind of left populist politics, right? Because he was able to unite people from kind of, wealthier, college-educated folks in major cities to more working class people. I think Nevada is a great example of the success of the Bernie Sanders campaign, and I hope the future of left politics, right? But I think at the same time now, without Bernie Sanders, we're sort of in this moment of being lost, right? Because Bernie Sanders sort of filled in that signifier for us. It's like, well, what are you? It's like, well, I'm a Sanders supporter, right? And that gave you a lot of coherence in your politics. And now we're seeing people sort of go off all different ways, which is something that's very dangerous, but is also very fundamental to this kind of populist politics, right? Because whenever you have this unifier, right, this signifier, this idea that unites people, whenever that gets challenged or dissipates, then the whole organization starts to collapse, right? So we really need to be returning to labor, and we need to be returning to class politics, because that's when we were most effective, I would say, on the Bernie campaign, and that's the only thing that's going to have the long-term viability to bring us into power, but to also allow us to think as a class instead of thinking as individuals. And that's another issue that we're falling into right now, right? We need to be able to have organizations that allow the working class across the United States to come up with our answers to the kind of the very fundamental and difficult questions that we have right now. Because the difficult questions we have right now are, one, what is class politics going to look like without a Bernie Sanders campaign to unite them? We can't return to the old politics of symbolism and ineffective movements that would just sort of like, they would rise and fall. And look, I was somebody who came up in the Occupy movement, which was a very exciting thing for me. But you can also see the lack of organization fundamental to that kind of politics, which I think is also, indicative of the kind of turn that a lot of like left theory had gone to in the United States and the Western world, I would say, was that it ends in this kind of ineffective politics, unfortunately. So we're here in a very difficult period of time, and I think that we need to say that, like, populism as an idea of organizing people in a mass against the system is how all democratic politics is always going to work, right? You always need to have the people on your side if you want to do politics, right? That's not actually like a very deep insight. So I think that, like, if that's what you mean by left populism, I think then, okay, we're in agreement. But this kind of squishy politics that basically eradicated the centrality of class politics towards the socialist struggle, I think that we need to move past that, because it's never going to deliver us the goods, because even when it comes into power, it doesn't have a kind of articulated idea behind it or structure behind it to enact the kind of changes that are fundamental. So I have a couple more things I want to add to that, but this is definitely will be best if we do a kind of Q&A. So be sure to jump in the chat with some questions, and I'll try to answer them as I can. And if you can hit us with a super chat, that's definitely very helpful. Not only to help the show because it pops up and it's easier for me to read as well. But I think another problem about of the kind of populism, and these again are fuzzy terms, but like there was a retreat from I'll be right to that, Tom. I love this, by the way. There was a retreat from the kind of materialist understanding of politics that is fundamental to Marxism, right? What is that, like, Marxism understands that the working class is the agent of political change, or is the hope of socialism, not because they're the most moral class or the most oppressed class in society. It's actually that they hold such a fundamental position to capitalist economics, right? So we can use that power to enact the radical change that we want. Left populism rejects that for a kind of squishy idea. And then the most powerful tool that we have, instead of being a material strategic tool, turns into a moral tool, right? And there's a lot that can be said about that, right? Like, I get mad, I'm indignant and furious about the way that working class people are treated. I grew up poor my whole life and I was being shit on by the rich, right? So I'm ready for that fight on that moral level. But what gives us the power is the scientific understanding of society that Marxism and socialism give us. And when we give that up to live only in the moral realm, to live only in the fiery speeches, then we lose a massive tool in our arsenal. So let me get to this. Tom from Yakubia, how's it going, Tom? You're the man. Did you see the Clash trader that quit Amazon because of how they were treating the workers? I did, and that's an amazing moment. I think it was. I'll say it's like it was definitely amazing to read it. I didn't expect it to be as strong of a letter as it ended up being. It's definitely encouraging from a moral standpoint, I have to say. I can't imagine how much that person was privy to within Amazon, having been there for so long. But you know what? I mean, I think what they've done over the past few months has really just been exceptionally despicable. So, look, that's an encouraging human sign in a time when we don't see much of that, for sure. All right, so we have one here from Julian Franks. In the era of COVID, there's no left or right, no top or bottom. We have insiders and outsiders. The outsiders, the essential workers, hold the power. Well, I think that you're definitely right that the essential workers do hold the power. But I think this inside-outside distinction is sort of, is fuzzy, right? I guess like inside-outside in the sense of like who's in power and who's not, right? That's definitely the case. But, the working class is like inside the capitalist system. They're fundamental to it. And I think it's important that we start to think about politics in that way, right? Because that actually, it's not just like, oh, these people are left out. No, these people are very much included. They're included to be exploited, right? And we need to have that understanding if we're going to use that power to our advantage. But, I definitely agree with the sentiment. I think it's definitely true that, that a lot is being revealed right now about the importance of, essential workers. Joshua Bauman is coming in to support me by saying, WTF peeps, smash that like button. So TMS can work the algorithm. Yeah, I appreciate it. And I also appreciate the comment too. Got Freudian slip there. Yeah, I think all that help is very important. We've been dealing a lot with YouTube, and I feel like our videos have been getting a lot less reach recently than they should. So please, if you're able to, hit us with these super chats and these like buttons, hitting that, and subscribe too. It's really important for us to continue to grow the show, because we're doing a lot of content each week. Just the live shows alone, just like 2 hours for the main show, and then we're doing about 2.5 to 3 hours even for the post game. So that's like 5 hours, and then we're doing these live streams, these interviews. We've been doing Sunday shows that have been public. So there's a lot of content out there, and it's really important that that's all getting seen by everybody. So as much help as you can give us by amplifying, amplifying this channel is really important, and appreciate it. David Hellman, Solidarity Fellow. David, yeah, I'm in good company, aren't I? So I think I have some questions in here. Are you convinced that the Democratic Party is the best pathway to channel worker efforts? Well, I know Michael did a really interesting conversation with a union organizer about the difficulty of third-party movements in the United States, with the Democratic Party. And Dustin Gustella, I might be pronouncing his last name wrong. But and his argument basically is that it's their party, and we don't have to like, we shouldn't like it at all. But that's just the way that American politics are set up. I think I'm very sympathetic to the argument, actually, for the most part. I think that we need to start thinking, though, a little bit differently about the party, right? Because I think that Marx is very right when he says that it's really important for there to be a workers' party, in the sense, not even for it to like hold power, but for us to be able to test our power, and to understand our strength and our relative weakness in society. Now, I don't think that we need to be attached to a party in the sense of like, something like the Green Party or the Democratic Party functioning in that way. I actually think what we do need is we need political organizations that are run by the working class, that can kind of operate on a kind of on a strategic level, because the problem is that the Democratic Party does control the ballot line across the country, and there's a great example of the kind of far-fetched idea that we live in a proper democracy, right? Is that you can't really access the ballot line if you're not a member of these two, which they always remind us, private organizations. So I think that we shouldn't like fall into a fetish of not running on a Democratic Party ballot line where it's beneficial to us. But I think that we need an organization that stands on its own, and is separate from the Democratic Party. So that organization, for example, just so we're clear about what I'm saying, could actually run electorally completely on the Democratic ballot line, right? They only run on the Democratic ballot line, and they would still be this independent organization that I'm talking about, because we need something that is doing more than just electoral work, but something that actually coordinating the entire working class movement. And I think that that's going to need to come out of organic movements that already exist. I don't think that you can go on Photoshop and make a logo and a Twitter page and say we have a new party organization, right? We need to have something that's organized in the labor unions. We need to have something that's organized in working class people. We definitely need something that is able to operate on that level. And it could that be the DSA? I think there's a lot of promise in that. So I had to remove some asshole. It's hard for me to remember how to do this. Okay. Yeah. So, it could definitely be something like the DSA. I think that there's a lot of, radical potential within the DSA, but I think it's all going to matter on momentum and what is kind of operating and correcting and articulating like the working class position, right? So that's sort of what I think our strategy needs to be. And I'm still working through exactly how we're going to operate on that level. But I think that we need an organization that operates for the working class alone explicitly, And if they are operating, for example, within a democratic ballot line, is very explicit about why they're doing it and how they're doing it, so that we don't get lost, because we don't want these movements. This is the fundamental danger that we're facing right now post Sanders. We do not want this movement. We do not want this democratic or socialist movement to rise up and then to just basically re-empower neoliberal capitalism. That's not our role. Like, we are trying to end that system. So we need to make sure that whatever strategies we're using, if we're playing with fire in that sense, are able to stand on their own and not falling into that trap. Can the Green Party candidate be leveraged to become the new Socialist Workers' Party? I don't think that the Green Party has the structure to create that, unfortunately. I think the Green Party has sort of operated in a very strange part of American politics. I think there are socialists and communists within the Green Party, but it's such a big tent organization that I don't think it's worth it to carry them with this movement, right? I don't think that we need their structures to operate. So I don't find very much benefit, for example, in like trying to turn the Green Party to an explicit like socialist workers party. Joshua Pinn, have you read Istefan Messaros, recommended by Paul O'Connell? I think you'd like it. A great critique of Hegelian dialectic in context of capital system. Well, thanks so much, Joshua. I'll definitely check it out. Paul O'Connell is awesome. So I take his suggestions very highly. I'll definitely check that out. I'm not familiar with it, though. But yeah, like dealing with Hegel is, for philosophy nerds is always a little bit of an activity that we can get lost in. I'll tell you, I'm in a weird place when it comes to reading philosophy right now. I very much have returned to reading Marx and reading Lenin, reading Debs. I've been reading a lot about the American populist movement. Those have been sort of my intellectual focuses lately, and reading a lot more of this, of hegemony and social strategy and the left populist movement, because I think that it was a very interesting movement, but I think that we need to grow out of it and critique it and find what we can, take from that potentially into the future, but also be able to leave it in the past. So, for sure, jump in here with any more questions that we have. But let me see if I have, so, then there's this other kind of tendency that we have on the left that I think it's not directly in this kind of like move the claw movement, but it's sort of like rode next to them, which was this like ideology critique. And, Zizek, who I like a lot, and actually a great Zizek book is The Sublime Object of Ideology, which I think is one of his better works, and it's an older one from the late 80s, too, actually, contemporary. Obviously he's a contemporary of these people, but, was rating these kind of important criticisms and retoolings of Marxism at the same time. And there's actually this really cool book by Verso, for people who are interested in this kind of thing, called Contingency, Hegemony, and Universality, where between conversations between Judith Butler, Laclau, and Slavoj Žižek, and you can imagine that Žižek was arguing for the universality, while Laclau was arguing for the hegemony, right? Because that's a fundamental idea of left populism, right? Is that you create the hegemonic movement that controls the culture. But I think there's this counter tendency too that came along with left populism, right? Was this idea of ideology in general. And then what we needed, and this was a kind of like anarchist idea. I think this is something that was very influential in Occupy, which is that you have the working class, and why have they not been the agent of revolution or radical change? Well, it's not, this is them arguing, not me. Well, it's not that they don't have party structures or organizations, which would be my that's what I think we need to do. It was that the working class hasn't been waking up, and they just need a big action and a big explosion of excitement and a big movement, right? That was the idea of Occupy, right? Which is do street theater, and then everyone will wake up and will join and create this mass movement. But again, it doesn't have the steam to maintain itself, and it's not articulate enough. This kind of idea of these mass, explosions of frustration. right? You need to have structure and organization to be able to take the disillusionment and frustrations of people, because people have been frustrated and disillusioned for a long time. And I think it's a very naive idea to think that it was because they just haven't been, shook, enough by, by a bunch of young folks, myself included, right? I think that was a kind of naive idea that some folks had, that we can just like show up and people are going to join us in our marches in the streets. So I think someone else is doing stuff on the Michael Brooks Show chat, but I guess like people are going on a Green Party thing. I think, as I said earlier, I don't think the Green Party functions in an interesting way as a third party. It's even viable, and I don't think that we've really dealt with the questions and the kind of hurdles of the Green Party. But again, like, this is not an organization that has shown a lot of promise, not even just electorally. I'm talking about the kind of people who are inside of it for a long time. There's a lot of strange tendencies within the Green Party. And look, I'm not like trying to like attack anybody personally. I think a lot of people are trying to do something to change the system. But I just don't think that we need to revive the Green Party. The Green Party came about in a kind of in a period of like wilderness for the United States left. And I think we have a much stronger position today, a much more articulate politics, that I don't think we need to go digging up the kind of traditional third party, protest vote organization. But I'll answer this super chat here from Artificial Morphous Man. What if Ventura ran Green Party and got 40% of the vote in November, beating Biden and Trump? Would they let him be president? I mean, these kind of hypotheticals are difficult to play with. I don't think that that's going to happen. It's like, if there are millions of Americans who are behind the Green Party, which doesn't functionally exist, I think it'd be difficult to pull an election from somebody like that, unless you did like electoral voter fraud. I had a kind of makeshift curtain, but the sunlight's not too bad, so it's okay. Jesus, Erico, Pelosi answer to the Americas was bad. The two Americas was bad. I've been doing free telemedicine. Oh, hey, Eric. Free telemedicine to help working folks who depends on risky work and must go to physical clinics due to lack of connectivity and affordability. PMC access both at home. Yeah. I appreciate the work you're doing, Eric. I'm not familiar actually with what Pelosi said, but I'm sure it was definitely not the kind of politics that we want to envision or put forward. All right. Well, let me see. So, I think that we're hitting this, this ideology question, I think is important, though, that, there is a kind of, I think Mark Fisher articulated it better, though, than a lot of the kind of movements that came after, right? I think Mark Fisher's idea of like capitalist realism is something that we need to deal with and sort of push through. And that's a real serious part of the ideology critique. I think Zizek does a really great job of showing how ideology functions as like the last bastion of the capitalist system. It was like Zizek has a line that's so funny, and I think it's on point. Is that Marx said that ideology is like it's like Marx said that ideology is like when they're doing it, but they don't know why, right? And that's in the German ideology, which is a great text, by the way. You should definitely check out. And Zizek sort of flipped it, though, and he says, what, like this kind of postmodern or like the late capitalism version of ideology is like, they know that they're doing it and they sort of know why, but they're just doing it anyway. And that's sort of like, that's the really difficult position that we're in right now, is there's a kind of like cynical aspect to politics and like radical movements that we have to really break through, right? So it's like, yes, it's the hopelessness, and then it's also people saying like actually like participating in making the hopelessness worse. So like that's like the Zizek criticism of the kind of radical politics sorry, not the radical politics, the kind of just malaise that we had on the American left, the Western left, and like the labor union left. Like they sort of understood that voting for Tony Blair and Bill Clinton like wasn't going to actually save them, but they're just going to do it anyway, right? So it wasn't even a question of like, oh, you need to wake these people up. It's a deeper political problem. So, look, the Bernie Sanders movement like really revived. The Bernie Sanders movement really revived a left critique of society. It revived a socialist critique of society that's very important. It brought class politics back into the mainstream. The difficulty is it arose at a time when so many of our political organizations, so many of the people who are influential thinkers and writers and leaders were very much influenced by this kind of fluffy idea of left populism that was all about decentering class, to have it as part of like a mass group of different oppressions, right? And I think that the lesson that we're needing to learn is that if we don't run with this kind of class politics, right? Not class exclusive, not class only, right? Don't let people lie and slander the position that of people who say that we need to return to working class politics, and saying that it's somehow in opposition to politics of liberation, for people's gender, race, sexualities, identity, etc. Right? Don't let them ever say that, because it's a nonsensical position, and it's just is meant to distract from the fundamental unease that a lot of people who are very comfortable don't like the idea of class first politics. So we need to revive the kind of traditional socialist movement with this new energy that we have. In the United States, we're in a very bad position in the sense that we don't have a recent tradition of strong socialist movements to look to, and we don't have these strong socialist organizations. But there's also an opportunity because we can build out of those, right? People, for example, like the Labor Party, that's going to be a difficult thing in the Labor Party because people have been voting Labor for years and they've got nothing from it, and essentially just got stabbed in the back by New Labor, and then by a lot of the centrists when it came to their treatment of the Brexit question. So Labor is in a difficult position, right? Because like to revive Labor means not only reviving like the socialist movement within the Labor Party, but it also means winning back the trust of working class Americans. I mean, of working class people in the UK. So here in the United States, we don't have that same difficulty, though it's an advantage that the Democratic Party has such a bad brand, with working class people, because they've been betrayed by it for so long, that like if we are able to create an organization that's running, sort of standing near the Democratic Party, using their ballot line when we can to our advantage, like we're able to move a lot with working class people, because we don't have the same kind of problem of them feeling betrayed by us. What we have to do there is win our trust. So we have to win their trust. So there's a lot of work to be done. I think that when we look back at the 2010s, those last decade, it will definitely be we will definitely say that this was a moment where this kind of populist philosophy was dominant on the left, and I think that it had a lot of advantages. It certainly stirred people up, but we're starting to see the kind of structural disadvantages of that politics. So I think that we have the opportunity now to rebuild a new movement and get away from the kind of structural flaws, the philosophical flaws of the populist left movement, and bring on into the future the best traditions of the populist movement in the actual sense, the like American populist movement of the late 19th century that became the Socialist Party. We have all these great American traditions of people really organizing around their class interests and creating a proletariat movement that was violently squashed by the ruling class in the mid 20th century. And we need to learn the lesson as to why that happened. But I think that we also need to learn that the kind of reorganization that came around the new left, and then what was called the populist left or the postmodern left or whatever you want to call it, that was never able to come close to what was done by the socialist movements that existed in their strength in the United States at the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So I think those are the traditions that we really need to be upholding and modernizing and bringing to the future. We do not need to go back into some kind of like cosplay thing, right, where we're just wearing the clothes of the old movements. It's more that like look, these are movements that were successful, and they were successful because they had a strong class base and they had strong organizations within the working class that were able to think and strategize. I think that we need to move away from the neoliberal individualization of politics. Politics should never be about what you're doing alone. Politics should always be what we're doing as a movement. And that's something that, that's something that very much came out of the kind of postmodern idea, right? And even the populism of the Claw move was very much always returned to you, the individual, right? And what we need to be doing is to creating like a class. We need to have that kind of understanding of ourselves, and that's the way that we can move forward. So, a lot of work to be done. We have a pretty great show coming for y'all tomorrow at 7. If y'all haven't, for Patreon members, I put up a good theory reading, just going all the way back to classics, Communist Manifesto, and some really great work by Samir Amin, who's a really great Marxist theorist. So I have a really great text by him that I picked out. Highly suggest reading that if you're interested in this. There's a really great piece in Damage Magazine, which I've been checking out a lot recently, on populism that I highly suggest reading. They're able to do a lot more in-depth look at this populist question. It's called I Can't Relate, so I highly suggest checking that out. Not to get myself in trouble with anybody, but I definitely think that a great text to read right now is What Is to Be Done by Lenin. He was dealing with a lot of similar questions when it comes to coalition building with other kind of like left movements or democratic movements. It's a very enlightening text. Lenin is one of the most interesting theorists, to read. I think that somebody asked a question, and I can't answer it right now, but I think that sounds like a good stream one day to look into. And I don't have a concrete answer on it either, but how do we avoid the degeneration of Leninism into Stalinism? I think that's is a real question that we have to look toward. I mean, the quick and easy answer obviously is that both of these movements developed in a very specific historical context, and I think people need to realize how barbaric and authoritarian Tsarist Russia was to understand that, like, the political institutions that were being taken over, they had those issues. But look, there were issues that developed within the Bolshevik party as well, and I think that we shouldn't sugarcoat that or ignore it. But regardless, Lenin is one of the more interesting Marxist thinkers. So for sure, even if you disagree with his final approach, he's definitely somebody that you should be checking out. And what else? I'm trying to think. I have, these aren't related to the populism question, the party question, but I highly suggest, again, Open Veins of Latin America. That's a book that really opened my eyes up a lot. So be sure to check that out. And I'd love to be able to chat some more in the future. I really enjoy these. Definitely check out the show tomorrow, and hope to talk to you all soon. All right, take care.